Okay, so today we're diving into a story about, well, I guess you could say second chances
Yeah,
in the world of professional football.
right.
And we're looking at Adam Chapman.
Hmm.
And, he's a player who seemed to have it all,
Yeah,
talent opportunity,
yeah,
a spot at Sheffield United.
right. And then, like, almost like a story that we've heard before.
Yeah,
It's this captivating image of this young athlete
yeah,
who's on the rise representing Northern Ireland at the under 21 level, you
yes,
know,
absolutely.
and then bam, a life altering event.
Yeah, at the peak of his potential.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the sources that we have,
Yeah.
they talk about how he was really like a rising star.
Mm.
And then to go from that to a 30-month sentence,
It's a huge contrast.
it is a stark contrast.
It's a huge
Yeah.
consequence.
Huge consequences. Yeah. And it makes you think, how quickly things can change in a career
Absolutely. And in life in general.
and in life.
And this wasn't just a small incident. This had major repercussions.
It really reverberated throughout the football community.
Yes, it did.
This wasn't just like, oh, he made a mistake and, we're going to forgive him and forget about it.
It's serious.
This was a loss of life. And so
I sent shockwaves, I think, through the community.
It did. And the sources don't really get into the public reaction too much.
Yeah.
But you have to imagine there were a lot of questions.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, could someone capable of this even come back from this?
Right. Is this something that can be forgiven?
Right, exactly. And would fans support him? Would teams even take a chance on him?
So how did Chapman navigate his return after serving his sentence?
Right, so he ends up signing with Oxford United
Okay.
for the 2011-12 season.
Wow. So that was his attempt to...
It was a very public attempt at redemption.
Yeah, redemption. Yeah.
And it really makes you think about, what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
Because this wasn't just him, regaining his form as an athlete.
Right.
This was about proving himself, personally and professionally.
Absolutely. And on this really public stage with everyone watching.
Exactly. Like, how do you even begin to do that?
Yes.
And were there expectations placed on him beyond his performance?
Right. Like, was he expected to apologize publicly or
Just
do
to say-
something?
Or was his performance enough?
Yeah.
And that's what's so fascinating.
It's interesting because the sources don't really delve into those specifics about his performance at Oxford.
Right.
So did he manage to get back to where he was before?
Right.
We just don't know.
We don't get those answers.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of silence in the source material speaks volumes.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like his performance becomes secondary.
Right.
One source calls his story a sobering reminder.
Yeah.
And I think that's really at the heart of this.
It's less about football and more about life.
Exactly. And it really prompts us to examine,
As a society,
how do we allow for second chances
without condoning harmful actions.
without condoning those actions. Exactly.
It's a really delicate balance.
It is.
And I think this story really highlights that.
It does. And it makes you wonder, what kind of support systems need to be in place for people who are trying to rebuild their lives after something like this?
And how can we foster that environment of compassion and understanding while still holding individuals accountable?
Precisely.
It's a question I think we all need to be thinking about.
It is. And I think, Chapman's story, it's a lens.
It is. It's like a case study almost.
It's a case study for looking at forgiveness and rehabilitation, not just in sports,
But in society as a whole.
exactly.
So it leaves us with a lot to think about.
It really does.
Like, how might Chapman's journey have been different if he was met with more compassion,
Right.
understanding?
It's a question worth pondering. Yeah.
Well, this has been a really thought-provoking deep dive.
It has
A lot to consider.
a lot to consider.
And we'll leave it there for today.
Sounds good.
Okay, so today we're really diving deep into a story.
Mm-hmm.
It's captivating, really, but also kind of a cautionary tale,
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those that makes you think.
It's about the rise and fall of Anthony Stokes.
And it brings up those pressures athletes face. And man, addiction is just so complicated.
Right, and for anyone who might not be glued to the football scores every week, Stokes wasn't just some guy who got in a bit of trouble. We're talking Celtic, Sunderland, big teams. But his story, well, it takes a turn, and not a good one.
It does make you think, though. We see these issues with athletes, especially once their careers start to fade. What happens after the cheering stops,
Exactly. And this court case, well, it gives us a way to look at all of that, using what happened and what people were saying at the time.
It becomes like a lens focusing on something bigger than just one guy.
So picture this. January 6, 2023. Dublin. And this isn't me exaggerating, it's like an action movie. Stokes is in this high-speed chase through the city, hitting 160 kilometers an hour, blowing through red lights, the whole dramatic scene.
That's just wild, especially in Dublin. It's not like he had open roads. Someone could have gotten seriously hurt.
It all ends at the gates of Phoenix Park, which I guess is fitting in a weird way.
Yeah, how often do you see a chase end there?
Stokes ditches the car, tries to run, but the police catch him pretty quickly. But here's where it gets really interesting. Inside the car, hidden in a sock, cocaine. 3,700 euros worth.
Whoa. See, and it's not even just having it on him, it's the hiding it that makes you think. Like, that points to maybe dealing, not just personal use.
Yeah, not your average speeding ticket situation anymore.
You're not even close. And get this, days later, they find Stokes again, this time with 86 illegal pills.
Oh, wow. So now we're talking multiple charges, serious legal trouble.
Exactly. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a pattern. And this is where it gets interesting. You've got two sides of the story coming out. His defense and then the prosecution.
Okay, so we're in the courtroom now. What's the defense's angle?
They're saying Stokes, he's struggling, right? Addiction problems, trying to get clean. Even claimed he was actually on his way to rehab when the cops caught him.
Oh, so they're going for the he needs help, not punishment approach.
Trying to, but then there's the fact that he had cocaine in his system still.
That complicates things, to say the least.
Definitely does. And the prosecution, they jumped on that.
Yeah, that's not a good look when you're arguing you're on the road to recovery.
Nope. And they really drove home how serious this was, the danger he put everyone in.
And the judge, she wasn't buying the defense's story either.
Not one bit. Even with Stokes pleading guilty, even with them asking for leniency, maybe rehab as part of the sentence.
She threw the book at him.
Pretty much. 15 months in prison, 5-year driving ban. Strong message.
Makes you wonder, was this just a one-time thing, bad choices fueled by addiction?
Mm-hmm.
Or is there a longer history here? And it turns out this wasn't Stokes's first run-in with the law, not even close.
Right. Back in 2013, assault conviction ended up paying 30,000 euros to the victim.
Whoa. That's not messing around. That was serious.
Seems like it. And there are other incidents too, missing court, even time served in another country, but the details on that are kind of murky.
Okay, so we've got this pattern, this build-up to this big arrest. It's definitely not what you expect from a pro athlete, even with all the pressure that comes with that life.
And that's where this story becomes something more, you know? It's not just about Stokes, it's about what happens when the cheering stops and these guys are left trying to figure out who they are without the game. It's tough, you know? They've spent their whole lives with that structure, the team, the competition.
The adrenaline. Don't forget the adrenaline, and then, boom, it's gone.
Just like that. And for some guys, it's a huge struggle to find their place in the world without it.
Without that validation, that constant pressure.
Exactly. And we've seen it so many times, unfortunately. Athletes turning to addiction, struggling with money, even ending up in legal trouble, all because they're trying to fill that void.
And then there's addiction itself, which is, well, it's a whole other beast.
Oh, absolutely. And it can happen to anyone, athletes included. Think about it. The pressure to perform, the physical toll, the mental grind of training.
And then suddenly that's all gone. Their whole routine is gone. It's no wonder some turn to substances to cope.
It's a way to numb the pain, at least for a little while.
Which brings us to another question. How do we, as a society, deal with addiction? Especially when it comes to athletes who often have a very public fall from grace.
Right. It's not just about punishment, is it? It's about getting them the help they need, addressing the root causes.
In Stokes' case, he's facing the consequences of his actions, but will this be a turning point?
That's what we don't know yet. Will he actually get the help he needs in prison, or will this just be another step down a bad path?
It makes you think about what more we could be doing, what kind of support system should be in place for athletes who are struggling.
Totally. And not just for athletes, but for anyone battling addiction. It's a complex issue, no easy answers.
Definitely not. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into Anthony Stokes' story, I think it leaves us with a lot to think about. It's a reminder that behind the headlines, the fame, the money, these are real people with real problems.
Absolutely. And I think it's a story that should make us think twice about judging too quickly. We never know what someone else is going through.
Everyone has a story, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes those stories take unexpected, even tragic turns. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. We explored the world of professional sports, the legal system, and the very real struggles of addiction.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And sometimes the most important stories are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers. It's like they build their whole identity around this one thing.
Right, and then it's gone, and they have to figure out, who am I now? What am I supposed to do? It's a huge adjustment.
And not everyone can handle that, you know? Especially when you think about the pressure they were under, the constant need to perform at this superhuman level.
And not just perform, but win. The stakes are so high in professional sports. The money, the fame, the expectations.
It's no wonder some of them crack under the pressure. And like we were saying, addiction is just one way that manifests.
Exactly. It's not an excuse, but it's a piece of the puzzle.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about the pressures on athletes, the challenges of transitioning out of professional sports, the complexities of addiction. What's the takeaway?
I think it's about understanding, these are human beings with their own strengths and weaknesses.
And sometimes those weaknesses are magnified by the spotlight.
Absolutely. And it's easy to judge from the outside looking in, but we never really know what someone else is going through.
That's so true. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Anthony Stokes' story, I think the biggest thing I'm left with is a sense of, well, empathy, I guess.
Me too. And a reminder that everyone has a story.
And sometimes those stories take unexpected turns. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. It's been a journey through the world of professional sports, the legal system, and the very human struggle with addiction.
A lot to think about.
It really is. And sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers. Ever find yourself like watching the news or scrolling online, see someone famous, and it hits you, do I even really know this person?
It's like this weird disconnect, right, between the public persona and the private individual.
Exactly. And how are we supposed to make sense of that, especially when things get complicated, Like, how do you reconcile someone's achievements with their personal life when those two things collide?
Yeah, it's a question that comes up a lot these days, especially with social media. Everyone's life is under a microscope.
Totally. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, the career of footballer Chet Evans. This article we've got here really digs into it, all his talent on the field, but also this huge legal case that kind of overshadowed everything.
It's one of those stories that really makes you think about how we judge people, Success, failure, all of it.
Okay, so before we get into all that, set the scene for us.
Yeah.
It's the early 2010s, football's in full swing.
Yeah.
Who is Chet Evans at this point in his career?
Imagine this. Young, hungry striker making a name for himself. Starts at Manchester City, talk about pressure. But it's with Sheffield United where he really explodes.
Wait, he was scoring like crazy back then, wasn't he? I'm having flashback to some crazy goals.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We're talking nearly 50 goals for Sheffield United. That's not just luck, that's talent. He even earns caps for the Wales national team, the whole package. At 23, he's living the dream. Fans adore him. Big clubs are interested. Bright future,
Sounds like he was on top of the world.
He was. Until 2012.
That's when everything changes, right?
One word. Accusation. Rape.
Mm-hmm.
And just like that, everything's different. This isn't some minor infraction. This is serious, legally and socially, especially for someone in the public eye.
Wow, yeah. The pressure that comes with that, for him, for the club, must be immense.
Sheffield United had to act fast, and they did. Contract. Gone. Didn't matter how many goals he'd scored, public opinion had already shifted.
So, in what felt like a split second, he goes from rising star to facing this incredibly serious charge dropped by his club. It's kind of a reminder that what happens off the pitch can really derail even the most promising careers. Huh?
And honestly, that was just the beginning. This case wasn't just about Chet Evans. It became a much bigger conversation about us. But we'll get into all that in a bit.
Okay, so I've got this meteoric rise followed by, well, a very public fall from grace. Where do we even go from here?
This is where the case itself and all the controversy around it really takes center stage. Because remember, this is 2012, social media is blowing up, everyone's got an opinion, and it all gets tangled up. Justice, judgment, what people are saying online, it's a lot.
It's like the whole world turned into a courtroom.
Exactly. And this is where Chet Evans' story stops being just about him and starts to become something much bigger.
So, last we left off, this incredibly talented footballer is staring down a serious charge, public opinion's already turning. What happens next?
Well, the legal process plays out. In that first trial, Chet Evans is found guilty, gets a 5-year prison sentence.
5 years? That's not nothing. Even if you wanted to come back to football after that, seems like that'd be tough.
Oh, absolutely. Those 5 years weren't just time served. They became, a turning point for him. Personally, professionally, the whole deal. And this is where things get really interesting because it's not just his story anymore, you know? It becomes this flashpoint for bigger conversations.
You're saying the Chet Evans case, it became about something bigger than just him.
Right. Happens all the time with these high-profile cases. They turn into like lightning rods. Suddenly everyone's debating all these huge, complicated social issues.
And what was the context back then? Is this right around when the hashtag #MeToo movement was gaining traction?
You're a bit ahead of ourselves there. Hashtag #MeToo hadn't exploded yet the way it did a few years later. But you're right. There was this growing awareness, right, about sexual assault, how often what happens, how these cases were handled. It was in the air.
So Chet Evans's case,
Yeah.
it's like it became symbolic of that whole conversation in a way.
Exactly. And it divided people, right? On one side, you had people saying, look, this is a victory. Even famous athletes aren't above the law. But on the other side,
There were people who felt like he was being made an example of.
yeah, exactly. They felt like maybe he was a scapegoat, caught up in the media frenzy, that he didn't get a fair shake. And remember, public opinion was already against him, even before the trial started.
Yeah, it's like everyone had already made up their minds. Guilty or not, the damage was done.
And it goes deeper than that, too, right?
Hmm.
The Evans case made people confront some really uncomfortable stuff. The power dynamics in sports, especially between male athletes and female fans. How we as a society think about consent, responsibility. It wasn't just about one night, it was about the whole culture.
So, wow. It wasn't even about whether he was guilty in a legal sense anymore. It was about the message it sent. Heavy stuff.
It was a lot to unpack then, and honestly, it still is. Because then the question became, okay, what happens next? Someone serves their time, are they allowed to move on, rebuild their lives, or will they always be defined by this one thing?
And for Chet Evans, that question was about to become very, very real. Because through it all, he always insisted he was innocent. And then things took another turn.
Retrial.
So much to unpack here. We've got this case, right, that's become about way more than just one guy, all these big questions swirling around. And then on top of it all, a retrial. That's not exactly common, is it?
It's definitely not the usual route, no. Things get kind of technical here, legally speaking, but basically new evidence came to light. And based on that, Evans gets a retrial in 2016. Important to remember, this doesn't automatically mean the first trial was wrong or anything, just that this new evidence, it was enough to take a second look.
Okay, so what happened? Did this new evidence actually change things?
It did. The retrial, it ends with Chet Evans being found not guilty. He's free to go. But, and this is where it gets even more complicated, not guilty doesn't equal innocent. You know what I mean?
Hold up. Gotta admit, I'm a little lost. What's the difference, legally speaking?
Okay, so think of it like this. Not guilty in the eyes of the law just means they couldn't prove it. Like the prosecution, they didn't have enough to convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, just means they couldn't prove it to the level they needed to.
Ah, okay, yeah. Big difference. So Evans is acquitted, but that doesn't erase everything, does it? There's still that shadow, you know?
Exactly. Public opinion, it's not a court of law. People had already made up their minds, and those are tough to change. Some folks, they heard not guilty, and that was it. Justice served, time to move on. But for a lot of others, it wasn't so simple. The accusations, they stuck.
So where does that leave him? He wants to play ball again, but our team's going to take that risk. With all the baggage,
Yeah.
the public opinion.
That's the million-dollar question, right? And there's no easy answer, no rule book for this kind of situation. Some clubs, they were hesitant, understandably right, worried about the fans, the reputation of the club. But others, they saw it differently. A talented player, legally allowed to work, end of story.
And what about Evans himself? What did he do?
He was determined, wanted to get back to the game, rebuild his career. And he did play for a few different clubs, you know, Chesterfield, even back to Sheffield United for a bit, Fleetwood Town. He was out there, on the pitch, but...
There's a but coming, isn't there?
Well, he never quite hit that same stride again. You know, the goal-scoring machine, the international appearances, it wasn't the same. Now, was that all because of what happened? Hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
Maybe being away from the game that long, it took its toll. Or maybe it was the emotional weight of it all, you know? Hard to tell.
It really makes you think, can you ever really separate the person from the player? Especially in this day and age, social media and all that.
Yeah.
Every little thing gets magnified, scrutinized.
It's complicated, that's for sure. And Ched Evans, his story, it's like it puts all that complexity on display. It's not just about football, it's about how we as a society deal with these really gray areas.
Mm.
Justice, second chances, what it means to be redeemed in the public eye. It's a lot.
It really is. Leaves you with a lot to think about, that's for sure. Like next time we see an athlete in the news, in the headlines, are we getting the full picture? And how much weight should we give to the past, even when someone's been cleared legally? Lots to ponder.
No easy answers, but that's why we're having this conversation, right?
But
It's a start. Ever notice how some stories, they stick with you? Like when a sports hero, someone at the top, totally crashes and burns.
yeah, it's like a fall from grace, right? Makes you think about the choices people make, even when they're on top of the world.
Exactly. And today we're diving deep into one of those stories. Fabrizio Maccoli, an Italian football star who went from hero to, well, convicted criminal. Now, some listeners might not know, but Maccoli, he was huge in Italy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he played for Juventus, Fiorentina, even the national team. Think about the talent, the fans, all of it. He was living the dream.
So where did it all go wrong? Well, that's what we're here to uncover. How did this guy go from the peak of football fame to, well, a prison cell? So let's rewind a bit. Macaulay, he was known for his incredible skill on the field, wasn't he? I mean, the guy could play.
Oh, he was electrifying.
Yeah.
Like, seriously, Mickley was a striker, which means scoring goals was his thing. And let me tell you, he did it with a style and precision that was just unreal.
Yeah.
Speed, creativity, technical skills. The guy was a defender's worst nightmare.
And you have to remember, football in Italy, it's not just a sport, it's everything.
It's a way of life. It's practically a religion over there. And Mickley, he wasn't just good. He was a symbol, especially in Palermo. He represented hope, pride, especially when Italian football was going through some tough times.
Wow. Yeah, that adds a whole other layer to it. So he's got this incredible talent, adored by fans. He's at the top of his game, and then bam, 2020 rolls around, and he's convicted of extortion. And it gets worse. This wasn't just any extortion. It was linked to the mafia. Turns out he asked the son of a known mafia boss to get money back for a friend. Not exactly a small-time disagreement.
Nope, not at all. It pointed right to Mickley being connected to some shady stuff, to say the least.
So how did the football world react to this? Was it like a complete shock?
You can say that. It definitely sent shockwaves through the sport. There were whispers before, rumors about Macaulay's character, maybe some questionable friendships here and there, but nothing concrete. And then, boom, this massive scandal explodes. He gets hit with a 3.5-year prison sentence. I mean, talk about a fall from grace.
Yeah, talk about a fall from grace, and it really makes you wonder what was going through his head. Did the fame, the pressure, did it all become too much?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely makes you think. The higher they climb, the harder they fall, right?
For sure. And in Mickley's case, it wasn't just about losing fans or sponsors. This was different. He betrayed the trust of an entire nation.
Absolutely. This scandal will forever be a part of his story, a dark stain on his legacy.
He ended up serving some time, got released in 2022, and had to finish his sentence with community service. But the damage was done.
It makes you think, right? Even when surrounded by success and adoration, there can be these hidden currents, these dangerous undertows.
It's a stark reminder that choices have consequences. And Mickley's story really highlights that.
Absolutely. And it also sheds light on a harsh reality in Italy, the influence of organized crime. This wasn't just one guy making bad decisions. It showed how deeply rooted these groups can be, reaching even into the world of professional sports.
It's a sobering thought, really. And it makes you wonder, do you think at the height of his career, could Mickley ever have imagined this future for himself? I guess that's something for everyone listening to ponder. It's not just a story about football. It's about the paths we choose, the company we keep, and how quickly it can all disappear.
And the ripple effects, how one person's actions can impact so many others. It's a story that stays with you, that's for sure.
It certainly does. And on that note, we'll leave you to consider the complexities of Fabrizio Maccoli's rise and fall. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time. Ever think about what happens when the cheering stops? You know, for athletes, they reach these incredible heights, representing their country, the world even. But then, what comes next?
Yeah, it's a question we don't often consider, do we?
Right. And today, we're going deep on a story that illustrates this, well, quite tragically. Carrie Charles, Ring a bell.
90s Premier League.
Exactly. Nottingham Forest even played for England.
Vaguely, yeah. What's he been up to?
Well, that's just it. His story takes a turn. Remember that Gascoigne tackle, FA Cup final, 91, brutal.
Okay, coming back to me now.
So picture this. Prime Charles on top of the world professionally but personally. Different story altogether.
Oh.
DUI charge early on. Kind of a sign, you know?
Yeah, sometimes those are warnings.
And they put him on an electronic tag later on, right? This guy takes a holiday, ditches the tag.
No way, seriously.
Seriously. Then assault charge. Courts are like, dude, last chance.
Didn't take it seriously then.
Yep. Nope. 2012, threatens a bouncer, ends up in prison for a year. Sad, really. But there's more to unpack here because this isn't just about one footballer's downfall.
Right, it speaks to a bigger issue. Addiction, it doesn't care who you are. Footballer, celebrity, everyday person, it grabs hold.
And I imagine the transition out of the sport, that's gotta be rough.
It's huge. One day you're surrounded by your team, your coaches, the roar of the crowd. Next, silence. That purpose, the support, gone.
Leaves you vulnerable.
Exactly. Without the right coping mechanisms, things can unwind quickly.
Charles is doing some incredible work now, though, right? Turning his experience into something positive.
Absolutely. He's become a huge advocate for mental health and addiction recovery. Goes into prisons, shares his story.
Powerful stuff. Makes you think, though, what more can we do? How do we better support athletes in that transition period?
The million-dollar question. It's complex, but Charles's story is a start. Shows us that redemption is possible, but also highlights the need for a better support system. For these athletes, they've given us so much, we need to give back.
Absolutely. There's always hope, and maybe by talking about this, by learning from stories like Gary Charles's, we can make a difference.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so this one is going to be good. We're diving deep into the story of Gary Charles.
Yeah, this one's a really something.
You guys requested it, wanted to know more about this footballer, Gary Charles, and let me tell you, it's quite the journey.
It really is.
We're talking crazy highs, some real lows, and everything in between.
It's a wild ride.
It is. So picture this. England, late 80s, early 90s.
Oh, yeah.
Football is life.
All right.
It's practically a religion. And right in the thick of it all, you've got this young, insanely talented footballer named Gary Charles.
Now, you got to remember, this isn't just any old period in English football.
Right.
This is when clubs like Nottingham Forest, where Charles starts out, are like massive.
Oh, yeah. Forest back then,
Huge.
they were the rock stars.
Oh.
Multiple European Cup wins, a style of play that had everyone talking.
And the pressure.
Oh, intense.
Imagine the weight on a young lad's shoulders. To break into that level as a right back?
I mean, right back, basically, you're defending against the guys who are constantly trying to score goals.
Exactly. It shows you how naturally gifted this guy Charles was.
Absolutely.
But even with all that talent, it's the 1991 FA Cup final that really kind of puts him on the map, but for a complicated reason.
Okay, so everyone listening who knows their football, you already know where I'm going with this. You got to talk about Gaza.
Gaza.
Paul Gascoigne, an icon,
Legend.
like England's Maradona.
And in that 91 final, Gaza makes this now infamous tackle on Charles. It was a wild, reckless play.
Oh, yeah.
And it ended up ruining Gaza's knee. He was never really the same player after that.
Tragic. Really was.
But what's so interesting is how that incident, even though Charles wasn't the one injured, it still kind of cast a shadow on his career. You know, it's like this weird footnote that follows him around.
Almost Shakespearean, isn't it?
Yeah.
2 careers forever linked by this one split-second event.
It really is.
But even with that hanging over him, Charles earns England caps.
Which, for anyone who may not be total football fanatics, means he gets to represent his country on the national team.
A huge deal. Absolutely massive. So you've got Charles, this young lad who's fought his way up through a legendary club system, now playing on the international stage. He goes on to play with Derby County and Aston Villa, both top-tier teams. I mean, his career's on fire. But, and there's always a but, right?
Always a but.
This is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
We talked about that pressure of playing for a club like Forest. But can you imagine living up to that England shirt?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole other level.
whole other world.
And then on top of that, you've got the Gaza incident kind of always in the background. I mean, how do you even process all that?
It's a lot to carry, especially for, like you were saying, a young guy navigating that world. Professional football's tough.
Oh, yeah.
And you add all that pressure on top of the challenges that come after a playing career ends, it's a recipe for a perfect storm.
Because let's be real, that transition out of pro sport, it's rough. You go from this like all-consuming life, this intense focus and dedication to the game, to suddenly it's over.
Yeah, and then what?
Right? What do you do with yourself? Who are you even outside of all that?
It's a huge identity shift. It really is. And sadly, a lot of athletes really struggle with it.
They do.
In Charles's case, he ends up turning to alcohol to cope.
Yeah.
A way to numb the pain, the confusion, that sense of loss.
And the sources we looked at, they don't sugarcoat it.
No, they don't.
Multiple arrests for drunk driving. There's even that incident where he gets an electronic tag removed so he can go on holiday.
Oh, yeah.
It just, I don't know, it paints this picture of a guy just trying to outrun something, you know?
Yeah, trying to escape something. And the sad thing is, even with that very public warning he got from the judge, after the assault charge, you think that'd be a wake-up call, but it just didn't seem to stick.
Almost like it wasn't enough to really make him face whatever it was he was trying to run from.
Yeah, it's like that with rock bottom sometimes. You gotta hit it hard before you can even start to think about climbing back up. And unfortunately with Charles, that's exactly what happens next.
2012. This is where things take a real turn, right?
Yeah.
The incident outside that nightclub, it ultimately leads to this 12-month prison sentence.
Right.
You almost think that's it,
Okay.
Another story of fame gone wrong. But, and this is what gets me, Gary Charles, he's a fighter.
He really is.
He's got this resilience, this like inner strength that maybe even he didn't realize he had.
Yeah.
And prison, in a way, it forces him to face it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Face those demons head on.
There's no escaping anything in there, is there?
Not at all. And what's amazing is he gets out and he immediately seeks help, right?
Yeah.
For his alcohol addiction.
Yeah.
That takes guts to admit you need help.
Yeah.
That's not weakness, that's strength.
Absolutely. It really is. And then what he does after that, that's what's really inspiring to me. He takes all that he's been through, uses it to help other athletes who are going through similar struggles. It's like he's taken all that pain and turned it into, I don't know, a purpose.
And the impact he must have. I mean, this is a guy who's lived it, right? The highest highs, the lowest lows, and now he's reaching out, offering guidance. Mm-hmm. It's incredibly powerful. And it just goes to show, if he can turn things around, well, there's hope for anyone.
It's a testament to that, isn't it? Redemption, second chances, they're possible. It's never going to be easy, but it's always worth fighting for. I think what Gary Charles' story really highlights is that behind all the headlines, all the trophies, all the fame, we're all just human at the end of the day. And sometimes those humans need a helping hand,
What a story. We started with him just a young lad on the pitch of the city ground, and we end with a guy rebuilding his life. It's a good reminder that it's never too late to change your story. Who knows what incredible chapters he'll write next. Thanks for joining us on this one. It's been quite a journey.
Yeah. Welcome to this deep dive. When we first saw Gavin Grant's name, we thought, okay, footballer, interesting life, maybe, but pretty standard, right?
Right. The usual trajectory, rise through the ranks, maybe some team transfers, hopefully a trophy or two.
Exactly. But then we dug into the research you sent, and whoa, this story takes a sharp turn. We're not just talking sports, we're talking serious crime.
Absolutely. It's a story that really makes you question everything you think you know about someone. This isn't just about goals and contracts. It's about a life sentence.
Okay, so before we get to the heavier stuff, let's rewind. What's the deal with Gavin Grant, the footballer? Paint us a picture.
So picture this young, up-and-coming talent. Starts out at Tooting and Mitcham, which isn't exactly Premier League, right?
Not exactly a household name.
Exactly. But then, boom, he gets signed to Gillingham.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big jump, even in the lower leagues. Shows real potential.
Okay, so he's on the move,
Yeah.
clearly talented, but I'm guessing this is where things start going south.
Well, even at this stage, there were already whispers of trouble brewing beneath the surface. It wasn't public knowledge, but while he was on loan to Gray's Athletic, he was actually under investigation for a murder.
Wait, hold on. What? He was playing professional football while being investigated for murder. That's insane.
It is wild, isn't it? And it gets even crazier. He violated curfew while on loan and got arrested. Now, he was later acquitted on those specific charges, but still talk about a red flag.
Yeah, that's not just a little slip-up. You'd think that would be the end of his career, right?
You'd think.
Mm-hmm.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is something we see time and time again. Public perception versus reality.
Mm-hmm.
He went on to sign with Wycombe Wanderers, then Bradford City. Like nobody knew or maybe nobody wanted to know.
It makes you wonder, was there any awareness within the football community? Were they turning a blind eye hoping for the best?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's what we're going to unpack today as we go deeper into Gavin Grant's story. Because what we learn about his time on the pitch is just the tip of the iceberg.
So we've got this successful footballer leading this double life, caught up in a world of violence, and then this twist with the appeal. It really leaves you wondering about the gray areas, the what-ifs.
Absolutely. Gavin Grant's story is a stark reminder that sometimes the person we see in the headlines is just a fraction of the whole picture. It makes you question your own judgments, your own perceptions of others. Do we ever really know anyone?
It's a heavy thought to leave on, for sure. This deep dive has been a roller coaster, to say the least. For you listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. Did any of the details surprise you? Head over to our socials and share your reactions. Until next time, remember, there's always more beneath the surface. This is the deep dive signing out. An appeal. So there was something about the original trial, something that might have changed the outcome.
That's what the appeal hinged on. It came down to some information that wasn't disclosed by the police regarding one of the key witnesses for the prosecution.
Hold it, so they're saying the police withheld evidence. That seems like a pretty big deal.
Huge deal. This kind of thing, even the possibility of it, it throws the entire fairness of the trial into question. If the jury hadn't been kept in the dark about something important about the witness, who knows what they would have decided?
Did the appeal say exactly what the police didn't reveal?
It's frustrating, but the sources we have don't go into specifics. They just say it was significant enough to potentially impact the jury's decision.
Okay, so what happened? Was there a retrial?
Sadly, no. Even with the possibility of this withheld information, the appeal was ultimately rejected in 2015.
Rejected. But if there was a chance, how can they just ignore that?
Well, the appeals court looked at everything again with this new information in mind. And they determined that even with the potential discrepancies, the evidence against Grant was still strong enough to uphold the original conviction.
Wow. That's a lot to process. We've got a talented athlete leading this double life, caught up in a world of violence, and then this twist with the appeal. It really leaves you wondering about the gray areas, the what-ifs.
Absolutely. Gavin Grant's story is a stark reminder that sometimes the person we see in the headlines is just a fraction of the whole picture. It makes you question your own judgments, your own perceptions of others. Do we ever really know anyone?
It's a heavy thought to leave on, for sure. This deep dive has been a roller coaster, to say the least. For you listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. Did any of the details surprise you? Head over to our socials and share your reactions. Until next time, remember, there's always more beneath the surface. This is the deep dive signing out.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're really going to get into it with a deep dive into the career of, well, a footballer. Some of you might know, others might not, Graham Rix. And trust me, this one's got it all. The highs, the lows, the unexpected turns you wouldn't believe.
Yeah, it's a story that really makes you think about what legacy even means, especially in a world like professional sports where it's all out there for everyone to see, the good and the bad, the wins, and, well, the controversies.
Exactly, and we've got a ton of stuff to go through today, articles, match reports, you name it. We're really trying to get to the heart of who Graham Rix was on and off the pitch, and honestly what his story can tell us about, well, I guess about a lot of things. So, are you ready?
Born ready, let's do it.
All right then, let's kick things off right at the beginning. Rix's journey starts right in the heart of English football, coming up through the ranks at Arsenal.
And remember, this is the 70s we're talking about here. Arsenal was a powerhouse back then. I mean, a real force to be reckoned with. So for Rix to not just make the team, but to actually become a key part of their game plan, and at such a young age, I mean, that really says something about his talent.
Yeah, it sounds like he was almost destined for greatness right from the start.
You could say that, yeah. And there's this one moment that really solidified his place in football history. You know what I'm talking about?
Hit me with it.
The 1979 FA Cup final.
All right, now you've got my attention. Everyone loves a good final match story. Set the scene for us. What was it like?
Picture it. Arsenal versus Manchester United Wembley Stadium is absolutely buzzing with energy. The tension is unreal. It's the final minutes of the match, and I'm not kidding, it could go either way.
I bet you could hear a pin drop.
And then Rix gets the ball way out wide and sends this incredible curling cross right onto the head of Alan Sunderland, and bam, goal. Arsenal wins the FA Cup.
Wow, talk about a storybook moment, right? And just for those of us who might not be as familiar with the FA Cup, how big of a deal are we talking here?
Oh, it's a massive deal. I mean, even back then, it was the biggest domestic cup competition in England. Winning it, I mean, that's a major accomplishment. And
Yeah.
to do it with a play like that, Ricks became a club legend overnight. I mean, just like that.
Yeah, I can see why a moment like that would define a career, but it didn't stop there, did it? He went on to play for England's national team, too.
He did, yeah. He earned himself 17 caps, played in 17 international matches, which is nothing to sneeze at, let me tell you. Even played in the 1982 World Cup.
Wow, the World Cup, that's huge. But you're right, it does seem like his international career maybe didn't quite reach those same heights as his time at Arsenal. Any idea why that was?
Well, think about it. England had some serious talent on that team, like really top-tier players. Just to compete at that level, let alone stand out, is incredibly difficult.
It's amazing to think about the kind of dedication and skill you need to even be in the running, let alone excel like he did at certain points. But it sounds like after his playing days were over, he wasn't quite done with football just yet.
Not even close. And this is where we really start to see a different side of Ricks. This is where he becomes the coach. And you know what? He actually found a lot of success, especially working with young players, particularly with Chelsea's youth team.
Now, for someone like me who maybe doesn't follow youth football quite as closely, what does that actually look like? What makes a good youth coach?
It's an interesting question. It really is. Because you're not just teaching skills, you're shaping futures, you know? A good youth coach can spot potential, nurture raw talent, and instill a love for the game that lasts a lifetime. And that's what that's what he was becoming known for.
So it sounds like he was set for this whole second act, almost like like a redemption arc or something. You see that in the movies.
It certainly looked that way, yeah. But we all know life rarely follows a script, don't we?
That's one way to put it. It sounds like you're leading up to something here. What happened next? This is where things take a bit of a turn, right?
That's right. And I think it's important we address it head on. Well, in 1999, Ricks was convicted of having unlawful sexual activity with a minor.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really serious.
It was, and he was sentenced to time in prison for it.
I can only imagine the impact that must have had. I mean, not just on him personally, but on his career, on his whole life, really.
Absolutely. It sent shockwaves through the entire football world. This wasn't just some small scandal, you know. This was a serious offense, and it really made people question his character, his judgment, especially given his work, with young players. The fallout from that was significant.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It makes you think about everything we've talked about, all those incredible highs in his career, and then to have something like this happen. What was going through his mind, during that time? And what about after he was released? Did he try to come back to football at all?
He did. He did try to come back. But let me tell you, it was not easy. It was a long and difficult road back. The stigma of that conviction, it just followed him everywhere. A lot of clubs, a lot of fans, they couldn't reconcile the player they'd admired, the coach they'd seen him become with the crime that he committed.
It makes you wonder about second chances, doesn't it?
Right.
I mean, even with all his past success, getting back into the game must have been incredibly challenging. Were there any clubs willing to give him a shot?
A few were. Yeah, a few were. But even those opportunities, they were always under a microscope. I mean, there was just constant scrutiny, constant pressure. He had a brief stint as a manager for Portsmouth, but it was turbulent to say the least, and it didn't last.
Do we know why? I mean, was it directly related to his past, or are there other things going on there?
It's hard to say for certain. I mean, these situations are always so layered, but it's safe to assume that his conviction played a role.
Yeah.
You got the media attention, the pressure from fans. It all just adds up to this incredibly difficult environment. And for Ricks, I mean, he's already trying to rebuild his life, rebuild his career, and you throw that kind of pressure cooker on top of it all. Well, it couldn't have been easy to navigate.
No, it makes sense. And it makes you think about those second chances. Like, were there any other opportunities where it seemed like he might be able to find his footing again, find a bit more stability?
He did later on become the manager at Heart of Midlothian, that's in Scotland. But even there, controversy seemed to follow him.
Really? What happened there?
This time it wasn't so much about Ricks directly, though. It was more about the club's owner, Vladimir Romanov.
Okay, I've heard that name.
Yeah, and he had this reputation for being very hands-on, let's say.
Hands-on how?
He was always interfering with team management, decision-making, you name it, just created this chaotic atmosphere, and well, it ultimately didn't work out for Rex.
It's almost like even when he was given another shot, the circumstances were just never on his side. It paints this picture of a man constantly trying to outrun his past, but it always seems to catch up.
It's a powerful way to put it, you know? It really makes you think about the lasting impact of our actions, both on and off the field.
It really does. It's a lot to process. I mean, on one hand, you have this incredibly talented individual who achieves some truly amazing things in football. But on the other hand, there's this serious offense that you can't just ignore. It really complicates how you view his whole legacy. Yeah, it really does feel like you're trying to reconcile these two totally different versions of the same guy, you know? You got Graham Ricks, the footballer, the one who had those incredible moments on the pitch. And then you have Graham Ricks, the man, the one who made these really serious mistakes in his personal life.
Well, that's the thing about life, isn't it? No one is just one thing, you know, good or bad. And I think Rick's story really forces us to sit with that, with the uncomfortable questions it brings up. How are we supposed to judge someone's legacy when it's so messy, when it's full of both these amazing triumphs and these undeniable controversies?
Exactly, because even though his coaching career didn't exactly pan out the way it might have, he never really left the world of football entirely, did he? I mean, what was he up to after Heart of Midlothian?
He was still involved in various roles, mostly behind the scenes, kind of out of the public eye, you know? It seems like that love for the game never went away for him, but his path, his place in it, it definitely took a very different turn.
It's hard not to wonder what was going through his mind during all that, you know? Was he, I don't know, trying to atone for his past, or maybe just trying to hold on to something he loved?
We can only speculate, really. But one thing's for sure, I, I mean, based on everything we've looked at, his story doesn't exactly have a Hollywood ending. His legacy, it's complicated. You can't separate it from the brilliance of his early career, those incredible highs. But you also can't ignore the weight of his actions, the consequences. It's all intertwined.
It really is. And it leaves you with so much to think about, so many questions. Can someone ever truly outrun their past? You know, especially when it's had such a public impact, when it's touched so many lives. I don't know, it's tough.
And that's kind of where we come in, isn't it? As individuals, we have to decide how we're going to engage with stories like this, with people like this. Do we only focus on the mistakes? Or do we try to hold space for the whole person, you know? Recognize the good and the bad, the complexity of it all.
That's a really good point. It's easy to jump to conclusions, to judge, especially these days with social media. But I think Rick's story really reminds us to slow down, to look deeper, consider all the layers of a life, the highs, the lows, all of it.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that legacy, for all of us, it's a complicated thing. Our actions, they have ripple effects, and the stories we leave behind, well, they're rarely simple or straightforward, that's for sure.
Well said. I think Graham Rick's journey, from those unforgettable victories at Arsenal to the really difficult challenges and controversies that followed, it's given us a lot to unpack today.
It really has, but that's what makes these conversations so fascinating, right? I mean, getting to delve into a story like this, peeling back the layers, uncovering the complexities beneath the surface, there's nothing quite like it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So to everyone listening, keep those thinking caps on because we've got a lot more deep dives to come. Until then. From prison cell to Premier League glory. I mean, come on. It's a story that sounds almost too good to be true.
It really does, doesn't it?
But that's exactly the journey we're taking a deep dive into today. Exploring the incredible life of, well, you know him, football legend Ian Wright.
Absolutely. And it's a story that, well, how do I put it? I think it speaks to all of us.
For sure.
About resilience, second chances, right? It's something we can all learn from. And you don't even have to be a diehard football fan to appreciate this one.
Yeah, this deep dive, it's not just about sports. It's about overcoming adversity, like how a challenging experience actually, it can become a turning point in your life.
Yeah.
So let's rewind the clock a little bit, back to the late 1980s, kind of set the stage for this incredible story.
All right, I'm ready. Let's do it.
So our sources paint a picture of Ian Wright as a young man in his early 20s, right? Just bursting with raw talent on the football field. But there's a big begin. But off the field, life was throwing him some serious curveballs. You know, imagine the pressure of being a young father-to-be.
Right.
Facing financial instability, just trying to make ends meet, you know?
Yeah.
It's a lot for anyone to handle.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. It's a really good reminder that there's often a lot more behind someone's actions than we than we realize, right?
Absolutely.
We see, we see the driving violations, we see the fines that, he couldn't pay, and that becomes the focus. But those are really just symptoms of a much larger struggle, wouldn't you say?
It's like the tip of the iceberg, right?
Exactly.
So all that weight of those pressures, the feeling of being trapped,
Yeah.
it led to, let's be honest, some poor decisions,
Mm.
eventually landing Wright a 32-day sentence in Chelmsford prison.
Yeah, and that's a life-altering experience, to say the least.
Absolutely.
And it's easy to focus on, the harsh realities of confinement.
Yeah.
And those were certainly a part of Wright's experience, but I think there's another layer here, right?
Mm.
A psychological impact that I think is often overlooked.
One of the things that really struck me, and I don't know if you had the same reaction when
Yeah.
I was reading through the source material, was the way Wright described that moment.
Okay.
The heavy clang of that prison cell door closing behind him.
Yeah.
The sudden isolation. It must have been the biggest wake-up call.
It is. It's that stripping away of autonomy, that forced confrontation with your actions and really the consequences of those actions. And I think, most significantly for Wright was probably the realization that this wasn't just about him anymore.
Of course not.
The hopes and dreams of his family, the family he wanted to provide for, that now rested on his shoulders.
It's interesting, you'd think being confined, stripped of your freedom, like that would be it, right? That would be the catalyst for despair.
Right.
But in Ian Wright's case, it seems like prison, it actually became this unlikely birthplace of this incredible comeback story.
It's a powerful example, I think, of how what seems like rock bottom can be the foundation, like the bedrock, for something truly extraordinary. And it's important to remember, right? Hitting rock bottom, it doesn't mean you have to stay there.
Right, right.
It's about reaching that point where the pain of staying the same, it outweighs the fear of the unknown.
Yeah, and our sources describe this profound shift in Wright's mindset. It happened during his time in prison. And it wasn't just regret or remorse, right?
Okay.
It was about something bigger. It was about taking responsibility.
Yeah.
It was about purpose.
And he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, in prison, stripped of everything, he said, all I had left was football. And in that space, he made a promise to himself, to God, that if he got another chance, he would grab it with both hands and he would dedicate himself completely to the game.
And that's exactly what he did.
Yeah.
Those 32 days, they became like this crucible. I don't know how else to describe it.
Right.
Forging a level of determination that, come on, we rarely witness. So he walks out of prison. He's still facing the same challenges.
Right.
It's the same world that seemed so overwhelming before, but something had shifted within him, don't you think?
Absolutely. And this is where we really see the true power of focus, right?
Okay.
It's one thing to have raw talent, a burning desire,
Sure.
but it's another thing entirely to translate that into consistent, disciplined action.
So he could have easily, let's be honest, he could easily fallen back into old habits.
Oh, yeah.
But, right, he was relentless. He joins Greenwich Borough, and for our listeners who don't know, that's a non-league team. So basically, he's starting from scratch.
Yeah.
But that talent, combined with this newfound drive, it was impossible to ignore.
Yeah. If you can imagine, right, being a scout for Crystal Palace, a much bigger club,
Yeah.
and you witness this raw talent, this just hunger to prove himself, it's no wonder they snapped him up.
Yeah. And he didn't just coast on his talent at Crystal Palace. It was like, and I know this might sound strange, but it's like that prison sentence. It was like, it stripped away everything that wasn't essential.
Yeah, yeah.
Leaving only this raw ambition. He was driven to succeed, not just for himself now,
Yeah.
but for his family.
And I think it's important to note here, this wasn't, some overnight success story. It was at Crystal Palace where Wright really honed his skills, showcasing not just his natural talent, but like you said, this incredible work ethic.
And the results speak for themselves. At Crystal Palace, he ends up shattering the club's scoring record.
Right.
We're talking an astonishing 117 goals in just 253 appearances. And that was just unheard of, right? This incredible feat catches the eye of Arsenal.
Of course.
And, the story. Pretty soon he's putting on that iconic red jersey on his way to becoming a club legend.
Yeah, and I think what's so inspiring about Ian Wright's story is that he never shied away from his past.
He never hid it.
He owned it, right? He owned his mistakes. He acknowledged that prison sentence, not as a badge of honor, but really as a testament to how far he had come. And that's
how much he had overcome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he used it, I think, As motivation.
Absolutely, not just for himself, by the way,
Yeah.
right? He used it to, I mean, he used his platform to inspire others,
Hmm.
and he showed the world that even from, I mean, come on, like the darkest moments, incredible things can emerge.
Yeah, his story is a powerful reminder, I think, that we all have the capacity for change, for growth, no matter our starting point.
Doesn't matter where you come from.
It does. It's about taking responsibility for our actions,
Yeah,
learning from our mistakes,
for sure.
and then using those experiences to sort of propel us forward,
Yeah.
to fuel our journey.
Yeah, it's funny because we hear about it all the time, right? Athletes who come from nothing and they claw their way to the top.
Yeah.
But Ian Wright's story, it adds another layer to that,
Mm.
right? Because it wasn't just about escaping poverty. It was about escaping I mean, let's just say it, a self-destructive cycle
Yeah.
that he could have very, very easily fallen into.
And that's what makes his message so resonant, right? It's not just for athletes, it's for,
It's for everyone.
it's for anybody who's ever felt stuck or who's ever
Mhm.
made a mistake that felt impossible to overcome.
Yeah, it makes you think, right? What is that one thing in your life that you've been putting off?
That's right.
That goal that you just, I don't know, you've deemed too difficult, or that fear that you just haven't faced head on. What if, like Ian Wright, you could turn that obstacle into, I don't know, a catalyst for your greatest achievement?
It's a powerful question. And I think, we all have setbacks in our lives.
Of course, we all stumble.
We stumble, but it's how we use those experiences,
It defines us.
that defines us, exactly. And, Ian Wright's journey from that prison cell to becoming a football legend, it just reminds us that sometimes, that lowest point, it can really be the catalyst for our greatest climb.
So today's deep dive tackles a heavy topic, one that's, well, hard to stomach, but even harder to ignore: the devastating and lasting impact of child abuse.
Mm-hmm.
We're going beyond the surface, using the case of former footballer Kiernan Hughes Mason as a lens to understand not just what happened, but why it matters in a much broader sense. You've shared legal documents and statements with me about Hughes Mason's conviction for the brutal assault of a 2-year-old girl in his care. And let me tell you, these sources are tough to read. But as always, we're here to unpack those details and extract those key insights.
And what's striking about this case, even for, those of us who deal with these horrific situations regularly, is how it lays bare a chilling reality. The attempts to conceal and explain away such brutality are often as disturbing as the acts themselves.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
Hughes Mason initially claimed the little girl's injuries were from a fall, right?
Precisely. A fall onto a dollhouse, to be exact. And while any injury to a child is concerning, the sheer severity of what this little girl endured simply didn't align with his explanation. We're talking injuries so severe, medical experts compared them to those sustained in a high-speed car crash.
Oh, wow. It's difficult to even imagine. The reports detail multiple fractures, internal injuries, and neurological damage, all in a child so young. It's almost unfathomable that someone could inflict that level of harm on someone so defenseless.
And it's in those discrepancies, those attempts to minimize or explain away the injuries, that a clearer picture often emerges. Medical professionals are trained to recognize the red flags, the inconsistencies that point to something more sinister than a simple accident.
So in this case, the severity of the injuries immediately raised alarms.
Absolutely. The girl was left unable to walk, sit, or communicate. She requires constant care, tube feeding, and assistance with even the most basic movements. These were not the kind of injuries that could be dismissed as a simple fall, no matter how hard Hughes Mason tried to spin that narrative.
It's heartbreaking. The sources describe her condition as a living hell, a stark contrast to the playful, vibrant life a 2-year-old should be living. This is where the emotional impact of these cases truly hits home.
And it highlights a crucial point that often gets lost in the legal jargon and headlines. The long-term consequences of child abuse are often invisible to the outside world. The physical scars are just one part of a much larger, more insidious trauma.
And those scars, both visible and invisible, can last a lifetime. In this case, the medical professionals didn't just find evidence of the single assault. They uncovered a pattern of abuse. 17 separate injuries on that tiny body. Some old, some healing, all telling a story of sustained cruelty.
Exactly. This wasn't a one-time loss of temper. It was a horrifying pattern of abuse, culminating in a horrific act. And that, unfortunately, is a pattern we see too often in these cases.
It's chilling. And to make matters worse, Hughes Mason didn't just try to explain away the injuries, he actively tried to cover up his actions, lying to 999 operators, paramedics, everyone. What does that tell us about the psychology of an abuser in this situation?
The attempt to conceal, to weave a fabricated narrative, often speaks volumes about the abuser's state of mind. It's a desperate attempt to evade accountability, to maintain control, and often to protect their own self-image.
So it's not just about escaping punishment, it's about maintaining this facade, this carefully constructed persona.
Precisely. And that's why understanding the psychology of abuse, the power dynamics at play, is as crucial as unpacking the physical evidence.
And speaking of evidence, this case had a chilling digital trail. Text sent by Hughes Mason just days before the attack saying things like, "She's actually getting on my nerves and I'm going to hit her."
Huh.
These weren't just fleeting thoughts, they were declarations of intent, weren't they?
Those messages are, yeah, bone-chilling. And sadly, they're becoming increasingly common in these types of cases. We leave digital fingerprints everywhere now, and those fingerprints can be incredibly revealing.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it, this technology? On one hand, it creates this digital trail that can be incredibly damning for abusers. But on the other hand, it also provides a platform for the kind of hateful rhetoric and violent fantasies that can fuel these acts.
Precisely. And it underscores the fact that technology is merely a tool. It can be used for good or evil, and it's up to us as a society to determine how we wield that tool and what safeguards we put in place to protect the vulnerable.
In this case, those text messages were a crucial piece of the puzzle, weren't they?
Absolutely. They provided that chilling glimpse into his state of mind leading up to the assault. And that's vital in these cases because it establishes intent. It proves this wasn't just a tragic accident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated act of violence.
And the jury saw through his denials, finding him guilty on charges of grievous bodily harm with intent and child cruelty. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. 14 years feels significant. But then you hear the family statement, and suddenly it feels utterly inadequate.
There's a disconnect, isn't there, between the legal definition of justice and the lived experience of the victims. 14 years is a substantial sentence in the eyes of the law, yes. But for that little girl, for her family, the sentence is a lifetime.
Their words are haunting. They talk about their daughter being trapped in a body that can no longer do what it should. They mourn all the milestones she'll never reach, all the joy that's been stolen from her.
Their statement underscores a point we often gloss over when discussing child abuse: the ripple effect. The trauma doesn't just impact the child, it radiates outward, tearing through families, shattering communities, and leaving behind a legacy of pain that can span generations.
And it forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question. What is justice in these cases? Can any prison sentence truly address the profound and lasting harm inflicted on a child and their loved ones?
That's the heart of the matter, isn't it? There's the legal definition of justice, the punishment meted out by the courts. But then there's the human cost, the lifelong sentence of pain and suffering endured by the victims. And reconciling those two is incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
It's a sobering thought, but it feels crucial to acknowledge those complexities, to move beyond the simplistic narrative of guilty and innocent and delve into the messy, uncomfortable realities of these cases.
Precisely. Because only then can we start having meaningful conversations about prevention, about support systems, about creating a world where these horrific acts are no longer tolerated.
So let's talk about those broader implications. The Hughes Mason case, as horrific as it is sadly not an isolated incident. What can you tell us about the prevalence of child abuse, the scope of this issue that often remains hidden behind closed doors?
You've likely heard the statistics, the numbers that are often difficult to grasp because they represent such a vast scale of suffering. But what we need to remember is that behind those statistics are real lives, real children whose pain is immeasurable.
It's so easy to get caught up in the numbers, to become desensitized to the enormity of the problem. What you said earlier about the digital trail resonated with me, that duality of technology. We have access to more information than ever before, yet the problems feel so vast, so overwhelming. Where do we even begin to address an issue as complex and pervasive as child abuse?
It's a daunting question, no doubt, but I think it starts with shifting our perspective. We often focus on the aftermath, on reacting to these horrific acts after they've occurred. But what if we invested as much energy, if not more, into prevention?
It feels like, yeah, we're conditioned to think about solutions after a crisis. But flipping that script, focusing on creating environments where abuse is less likely to occur in the first place, that's where the real power lies, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's about fostering a culture of awareness, Where we're not just reactive, but proactive in safeguarding children. And that starts with education.
Okay, so let's talk specifics. What does that education look like? Who needs to be educated, and what do they need to know?
It needs to be multifaceted. We need to empower children themselves to recognize and report abuse, to understand that they have a voice and that their feelings matter. That means creating safe spaces for them to speak up, whether it's at school, in their communities, or within their own families.
And that means having those uncomfortable conversations, right? The ones that some adults might shy away from. Because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing or making things worse.
Exactly. But silence is often the breeding ground for abuse. We need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, with having open and honest conversations about healthy relationships, boundaries, and consent, starting at a young age.
It's about changing the narrative, isn't it? Shifting from a culture of secrecy and shame to one of openness and support.
Precisely. And that requires a collective effort. It's not just on parents or educators, it's on all of us to be vigilant, to recognize the signs of abuse, and to know how to respond if we suspect something is wrong.
So if someone listening right now is thinking, okay, I want to be part of that change, but I don't even know where to begin, what would you advise them to do?
There are so many ways to make a difference. Educate yourself on the signs of abuse and the resources available in your community. Support organizations that are working to prevent child abuse and support survivors. And most importantly, be an advocate for children. Speak up if you see something that doesn't feel right, even if it feels uncomfortable or inconvenient.
Because that one act of courage, that willingness to break the silence, could be life-changing for a child. It's a heavy topic, there's no denying that. But as we've discussed today, it's a conversation we can no longer afford to avoid.
Absolutely. This deep dive into the Hughes Mason case has exposed a painful reality, but it's also illuminated a path forward. By confronting these issues head-on, by shining a light on the darkest corners of our society, we can create a brighter future for all children.
And that's what we have to hold on to, that sense of hope, that belief in the power of collective action to create lasting change. This conversation doesn't end here. In fact, it's just a beginning.
Well said. And if this deep dive has stirred up difficult emotions or brought up past experiences, please remember that you're not alone. There are resources available to help you heal and find support.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll leave you with this. How will you choose to be part of the solution? Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
All right, so we're diving into a story today, a story about football, but also, well, about the choices we make, choices that can completely derail even the most promising careers.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Marlon King. The name probably rings a bell, Premier League fans especially, but it's not just the goals, right?
Yeah.
It's the other stuff, the stuff that landed him in court. More than once. So we've got a stack of articles here covering the highs and, let's be honest, some really devastating lows. What we're trying to understand is how someone with that much potential, that much talent, ends up, well, where he did.
Yeah, and that's the thing that really gets you, That's what really jumps out from all of this. It's that contrast, right?
Mm-hmm.
You see the early promise, the guy's playing for Watford, Wigan Athletic, even gets called up to the Jamaican national teams. Like, this is it. This is the dream.
Living the dream.
Exactly. And yet at the same time, almost from the get-go, there are these red flags,
Right from the start. And that's what I find interesting, this first conviction, receiving stolen goods. Okay, a BMW convertible. Not exactly small potatoes.
No, exactly.
But still, you could almost write it off. Young guy, maybe a bit reckless, bad judgment, whatever. But then, knowing what we know now, was it just a blip or was it already a sign of something more serious?
Hard to say looking back,
Right.
But it's true. It's rarely just a one-off, is it? And sure enough, in 2009, things escalate, and they escalate badly. The sexual assault and ABH conviction,
Yeah,
that's not just legal trouble anymore. That changes how people see him forever.
absolutely.
This was a young woman, a university student, out in a nightclub, and the details are, well, they're awful. Groping her, then the violence, a broken nose, other injuries. I mean, it paints a very different picture
Completely
to
different.
the one we see on the pitch.
And the reaction to it, I mean, it sent shockwaves right through the footballing world. 18 months in prison. Wigan Athletic. They dropped him immediately. You'd think that would be it, the wake-up call, the biggest possible consequence. So was his career over at that point? I mean, did anyone even think about taking him after that?
You would think, would you? The stigma that comes with that kind of offense, especially in the public eye, it's huge. And it did have an impact, for sure. Some clubs wouldn't touch him, said it would damage their reputation. Understandably, there were a few short contracts here and there, attempts to, I guess, rebuild his career. But that conviction, it was always there, hanging over him.
A shadow, yeah. So some second chances, but always that uphill battle. Did he ever, address what happened publicly? I mean, did he express remorse? Anything to suggest he understood that he was trying to change? Or was it just straight back to business as usual?
Well, that's where it gets complicated. There were apologies, statements released through, PR people. But there were also attempts to downplay his role, shift the blame. A lot of people questioned how sincere he was being.
Right. Because
And unfortunately, actions speak louder than words, right? And in 2014, just a few years later, he's involved in this hit-and-run incident, causes serious injury. Another prison sentence. It's a pattern. And it makes you wonder about genuine change, doesn't it?
it really does. And it makes you think, were there points where things could have gone differently after that first conviction? Could there have been some kind of intervention, counseling maybe, mentorship,
Yeah.
something to address whatever was going on? Or even after 2009, after everything, could there have been a more focused effort on rehabilitation, not just punishment?
That's a million-dollar question, isn't it? Was there a missed opportunity somewhere? It's hard to say for sure now, but these are the conversations we need to be having, especially when you're talking about young athletes thrust into this world of fame and fortune, often without the support or guidance they need.
It's a sad story, really. Tragic, even. And you're right, King's story is often held up as a cautionary tale, look what can happen, that sort of thing. But it seems to me it highlights something else, this really complicated interplay between talent, opportunity, the choices we make, and the lack of a clear path back, a roadmap to redemption.
Absolutely. It's messy. It leaves us with more questions than answers, if we're being honest. What does meaningful rehabilitation actually look like in a case like this? Can someone with a past like Marlon King's ever truly outrun it? Or are they, or any of us, forever defined by our worst actions? Tough questions, but important ones we all need to think about, I think. Okay, so we're diving into a tough one today, a story that's really hard to stomach.
Yeah, definitely a tough one.
Nathan Ashton.
Right.
Remember him? Star footballer,
Okay.
Premier League,
Wow.
and now he's facing serious time. Like 16 years serious.
16 years.
Or rape boom.
Oh my gosh.
Twice.
Wow.
I gotta say, prepping for this, reading through everything, it's just, how does someone go from that level of success to this?
Yeah, it's a real gut punch for sure. The contrast is just, it's hard to wrap your head around. But I think as we get into Ashton's story, it's important to remember that this, as tragic as it is, isn't an isolated incident.
Right.
We've seen these kinds of falls from grace before, and unfortunately, they tend to reveal some uncomfortable truths about power, fame, the pressures that athletes face, especially in the public eye.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get into it. Ashton's crimes. It's heavy stuff. The first assault, back in 2015, he attacks a woman in a car. And the detail that really gets to me is that he tells her, "You'll live." It's like he thinks he's doing her a favor, instead of, ooh. Sends chills down my spine.
Yeah, it's chilling, and I think it's incredibly revealing. That statement, it suggests a disturbing level of control, this belief in his power over another person's life. And you have to think about the context here. This is a Premier League footballer. The fame, the adulation, it can create a really dangerous sense of entitlement. It can really blur the lines of acceptable behavior.
And then, years later, he does it again. This time, the victim was asleep at a friend's house, completely vulnerable. Both women, they went through hell, years of silence out of fear, then the entire ordeal of the trial. And their victim impact statements, reading those, incredibly powerful, talking about the trauma, how this is something that never really goes away.
And that's the heartbreaking reality for so many survivors of sexual assault. The fear, the self-blame, the very real possibility that they won't be believed if they come forward. Studies actually show that these fears are often amplified when the perpetrator is in a position of power or influence, like a celebrity athlete, for example.
Right.
It creates this immense pressure to stay silent.
It just gets more complicated, because 2015 wasn't just the year of that first assault. Ashton was also convicted of armed robbery that same year. So this wasn't just a fall from grace, was it? It seems like there was already this pattern of criminal behavior even before his football career went downhill.
Exactly. And that's where things get really complex.
Mhm.
Was this darker side always there, maybe masked by his success and the accolades?
Right.
Or did the pressures of being a professional athlete, maybe underlying mental health issues, did those contribute to this destructive path? It's a question that's really difficult, maybe even impossible to answer definitively, but it highlights the need for greater awareness and support systems within professional sports.
It really makes you think about the immense pressure on these young athletes.
Yeah.
The adulation, the money, the sudden fame. It's a lot to handle for anyone.
Oh, absolutely.
And then you factor in the potential for mental health issues, which might be overlooked or even made worse by that pressure. It's a recipe for disaster if the right support isn't there.
It really is. And I think we have to remember that these aren't just talented athletes. They're young people, often thrust into really extraordinary circumstances. And when things start to go wrong, whether it's an injury, declining performance, or just the eventual end of their career, they can find themselves adrift. Struggling to reconcile who they are with their past glory, it's a recipe for disaster if the right support isn't in place.
Yeah. This whole case, it just makes you wonder, were there signs, red flags that we all missed? Or maybe, even worse, chose to ignore because he was a star.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think it forces us to confront our own perceptions. We tend to put athletes on a pedestal, but we need to remember they're human beings. Capable of great things, yeah, but also capable of terrible things. This case has to serve as a reminder. We need to hold people accountable for their actions, regardless of their status, their talent, or their past accomplishments.
It's a lot to process, for sure. But I think you've hit on something incredibly important there. We can't just focus on the fall. We have to look at the system that often allows these situations to happen in the first place.
Exactly. It's about fostering a culture of respect, accountability, and support, on and off the field.
So I'm left with this unsettling question after this deep dive. What can we do as individuals to make sure that history doesn't keep repeating itself?
Yeah.
What can we do?
All right, then. We're diving into the story of Peter Swan.
Yeah, legend and tragedy, all wrapped up in one.
It's all over these articles you sent, can't escape it. A career packed with what-ifs. That's what we're digging into today, right?
And the context, it can't be ignored. We're talking about English football in the early 60s.
Not just any old time for the sport.
This is post-war, right? Football wasn't just a game, that it was breathing life back into the nation. Hope, you know?
And right there in the thick of it, you've got Peter Swan, born 36, starts playing for Sheffield Wednesday at just 17.
17. Can you imagine that now?
Talk about starting young.
Not just starting, but he becomes vital to the team almost instantly. The descriptions I found of his playing style, remarkable. Picture this.
Go on.
A chess grandmaster, but on the pitch. That was Peter Swan. Seeing plays before they happened, stopping attacks before they even began.
I'm trying to get a visual here.
One journalist even said watching Swan tackled, quote, like a panther.
Okay, now that's an image. But this wasn't just brute force, right? Swan wasn't just some enforcer out there.
Absolutely not. His intelligence on the field, tactical awareness, legendary.
Like what? Give me an example.
One match, described in your research actually, Swan single-handedly sets up this offside trap. Catches the other team completely off guard, not once, not twice, but 3 times in a row.
This guy's playing four-dimensional chess.
Well, everyone else is stuck on checkers. Exactly.
No wonder they considered him one of England's best.
And he wasn't confined to club level either. 19 caps for the national team between 1960 and 62.
Yeah.
That's not just showing up, that's making a statement.
Huge achievement.
More than huge. Back then, earning a spot on the national team, especially as a defender, royalty. One of the finest England had to offer, they called him.
So we've got a star on the rise, brains and brawn, playing at the highest level. This is shaping up to be one for the history books.
It is, but 1964, that's when everything changes. Not just for Peter Swan, for English football as a whole.
1964. That's the year, you said. What could derail a career going that strong?
It's the scandal. Still talked about, even now. Peter Swan and 2 of his teammates from Sheffield Wednesday, Tony Kaye and David Lane, what they were accused of, still sends chills down the spines of club owners today. Match fixing.
Match fixing. Wait, are you saying they threw a game deliberately?
The accusation was that they bet on their own team to lose against Ipswich Town. And not just any game either.
Go on.
This was the final game of the season. 1961-62 season.
And they did lose that game, for the record.
Sheffield Wednesday, they lost 2-0.
Okay.
Now, to be fair to Swan, he always insisted he was innocent, said the match was lost fair and square, their bets had nothing to do with it.
But the damage was done, I'm guessing.
Oh, absolutely.
So what happens next? You get accused of something like that at the heart of English football. What's fallout?
The FA, the Football Association, they didn't mess around. Lifetime bans for all 3 players.
Lifetime. That seems extreme.
It was supposed to. This was a different time, remember. Football was rebuilding its image after the war. And match fixing. That cut right to the core of what the sport was supposed to be about, fair play.
They wanted to send a message?
No doubt about it. This behavior would not be tolerated.
And Swan himself, on top of the ban, any other?
He served 4 months in prison.
Wow.
This wasn't just breaking the rules of the game. This was a serious offense. Criminal offense in their eyes.
From national hero to prison. That's rough. And you mentioned this all happened right before the '66 World Cup.
Which England won, of course, on home soil.
Can't imagine what Swan must have felt like watching that.
To be that close to something so huge, a chance to be part of history, and to have to watch it all from the sidelines.
Adds a whole other dimension to the what if of his career, doesn't it? What if this scandal never happened?
He was supposed to be a key part of that '66 team. By all accounts, destined for greatness. Instead, he's left carrying the weight of what might have been. It really makes you question, fate, how fragile a legacy can be.
So we left Swan watching that '66 World Cup, career in pieces, seemingly. But this is a deep dive, so something tells me that's not how the story ends.
So it's far from over. 1972. 8 years after the scandal, Swan's ban is lifted.
8 years. That's a lifetime in football terms, isn't it? And not just prison, but banished from the game you love.
Exactly. To even think about coming back after all that.
Did he?
He did. And here's where it gets really interesting, right? 36 years old. Most players, they're thinking about retiring at that age, winding down. But Swan.
Yeah.
He returns to Sheffield Wednesday.
No way. Seriously.
At 36.
Yeah.
To have that kind of, resilience, love for the game, incredible. But realistically, after 8 years out, could he even play at that level anymore?
Good question.
The sources all seem to agree he was never quite the same. The speed, that agility he was known for, it wasn't all there.
Makes sense.
But what comes through even stronger in the writing is the respect for him. The sheer force of will it took to even step back onto that pitch. I read one journalist who said, Swan's return, it wasn't about trying to relive past glory. It was about, quote, facing down a ghost.
There's a real sense of trying to make things right in that, I guess. Did he ever play anywhere else after Sheffield Wednesday,
Briefly, for Bury.
Mm-hmm.
But he retired for good in '73.
Kind of poetic when you think about it. Starts and ends his career with Sheffield Wednesday.
A true one-club man, you could say. Despite everything.
Says a lot about him, doesn't it? When did Swan pass away?
2021.
So looking back on a life, a career like that, full of such incredible highs and lows, how do you even begin to sum up Peter Swan's legacy?
It's complicated, isn't it? This is a player who, by all accounts, was destined for greatness.
Right.
But that scandal, that shadow, it never really went away. And you can't help but wonder, does the brilliance of what he could have achieved, does that make the tragedy even sharper?
Makes you think about choices, doesn't it? How one decision, one moment of weakness maybe can echo through your whole life.
And the idea of forgiveness. Of ourselves, of others. Peter Swan's story, it reminds us that even the brightest stars, they can stumble.
It's a story of talent, of tragedy, ambition, regret.
Story that stays with you.
Long after the final whistle. This deep dive into Peter Swan, it's a good reminder that sometimes the best stories in sports, they aren't about the wins and losses on the scoreboard. It's about the people behind the legends and the choices they make. Join us next time when we'll take another deep dive into a topic we think you'll find fascinating. Okay, so get this. Imagine a soccer player nicknamed the Lawnmower.
The Lawnmower.
Yeah, the Lawnmower.
Okay.
You thinking graceful passes, right?
I'd say so, yeah.
Well, not exactly.
No.
Today's deep dive takes us into the world of Stigtofting.
Stigtofting.
A Danish footballer who was as famous for his explosive temper as he was for his on-field talent.
Oh, this is going to be good.
We've got excerpts about his entire journey from his first team to his later career, and let me tell you, it's wild.
I can imagine. What a story.
So we're diving into the life and career of this guy, Stigtofting.
All right, let's do it. The Lawnmower, huh? I'm intrigued.
Right. I mean, with a nickname like that, you gotta wonder what he was like on the pitch.
Yeah, not your average player, that's for
Mm.
sure. So where do we start with this guy?
Well, Tofting starts his career in Denmark, playing for AGF Aarhus.
Okay, AGF Aarhus, got it. What were those early days like?
He quickly made a name for himself.
Really? How so?
But we're not talking about a goal-scoring superstar.
Ah, so a different kind of player then.
Think more like, I don't know, like a rabid dog in midfield, relentlessly chasing down opponents, winning the ball back, and launching attacks.
Okay, so like the engine of the team, the enforcer.
Exactly. He was a tough tackling defensive midfielder, pure grit and determination.
The human wrecking ball protecting the goal.
Exactly. And clearly he was good at it.
It had to be to get a nickname like the lawnmower.
Good enough to catch the eye of Hamburger SV in Germany.
Now that's a big leap, isn't it?
Huge.
Playing in the Bundesliga, one of the top leagues in the world.
Solidified his place as a force to be reckoned with.
So he's making waves, big leagues, international stage. What comes next for the lawnmower?
And then comes the 2002 World Cup.
World Cup. All right, now we're talking. Big stage for him. How'd he do?
Denmark versus France.
Denmark versus France. Okay. For those of us who, don't follow every single match, why was this game such a big deal?
Imagine this. France was the defending champion,
Okay.
a team stacked with superstars.
So the underdogs.
And Denmark. They weren't given much of a chance.
The odds were stacked against them.
But then they pulled off this incredible upset,
No way. They beat France.
winning 2-0.
2-0.
Wow. And Tofting played a crucial role in
Ah.
that victory.
So he's a national hero at this point, right?
Okay, so that's got to be a career high, right?
Things like it.
But I have a feeling this is where things get a little complicated.
Oh.
This is where the whole temperament part of his story kicks in.
Uh-oh, this should be interesting. The lawnmower
Uh-huh.
in full effect.
Yeah.
This incident we're about to discuss happened right after that huge World Cup win.
Oh, no.
Imagine that high, that wave of celebration.
Yeah.
And then it all comes crashing down.
Okay, so set the scene for us.
Okay.
What exactly happened?
So picture this. Tofting and his teammates are out celebrating the World Cup victory.
Okay.
They end up at this cafe in Copenhagen,
All right.
and there's a disagreement with the owner.
Oh, no.
And Tofting, well, he loses his cool completely.
Oh, boy.
Headbutts the owner right there in the cafe.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah.
He headbutted him.
Yes?
I mean, we know his nickname was the lawnmower, but this is taking it to a whole other level.
It definitely wasn't a gentle nudge, let's just say that.
So what happened?
This resulted in an arrest,
Oh, my goodness.
a very public trial.
Yeah.
And ultimately, Tofting received a 4-month jail sentence for assault.
Wow. That's a massive blow.
It was.
Think about the impact on his career, his reputation, of everything he'd worked for.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to come back from something like that.
And here's where it gets even crazier. You mentioned that right before this incident, Tofting had just signed with Bolton Wanderers
Yes.
in the English Premier League.
One of the most prestigious and competitive leagues in the world.
It was a dream move for him.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was huge.
So he's on the verge of this huge opportunity, about to reach the pinnacle of his career, and then this legal bomb drops.
Just like that.
What was that like for him, knowing he could lose it all?
I can't imagine. He even writes about this period in his autobiography.
Yeah.
Talking about the immense pressure he was under.
Yeah.
The way his temper had always been this kind of like ticking time bomb.
Oh, wow.
It's a really raw and honest look at the struggles he faced.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about the pressure athletes face.
I know, right?
Especially at that level of competition.
It's intense.
Intensity, the scrutiny.
All eyes are on you.
It's got to be overwhelming at times.
Yeah, definitely a double-edged sword.
Right.
That same fire that made him such a force on the field could also erupt in destructive ways off the field.
And in this case, it had serious consequences.
It did.
So what happens after the jail time?
Yeah, what happens next?
Does this mark the end of his soccer career? So he serves his time. Does he get a second chance in the soccer world?
He does.
Really?
Yeah, not everyone thought he deserved it.
I can imagine.
But talent like his is hard to ignore.
That's true.
He returns to his old stomping ground, AGF Aarhus, a chance to rebuild, to prove himself again. Back to familiar ground.
Right.
But then things take an unexpected turn. Right?
Yeah, they do.
He ends up playing for Tianjin in China.
Wow.
That's a world away, literally and figuratively.
It is.
What prompted that move?
It's a fascinating chapter. You know, on one hand, his talent was undeniable.
All right.
Teams were willing to look past the controversy because he brought something unique to the field.
Yeah.
But It was also a chance for a fresh start, a chance to escape the constant scrutiny and judgment he faced in Europe.
So clean slate in a way.
Exactly.
Okay.
And while details about his time in China are scarce in the research you provided,
Yeah.
it speaks volumes that he was able to continue his professional career at all after everything that had happened.
It really highlights this kind of complex relationship between talent, actions, and second chances, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah.
So how is Tofting viewed in Denmark today?
It's complicated.
Some see him as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even with incredible talent, one moment of poor judgment can have lasting consequences.
Right.
Others view him as someone who made mistakes, owned up to them, and ultimately found redemption on and off the field.
And he doesn't shy away from his past.
No, he doesn't.
In his autobiography, he actually goes into detail about his rough upbringing, how it shaped his view of the world.
Yeah, he talks about growing up in a tough neighborhood
Right.
where you had to fight for everything.
Yeah.
And while that mentality might have served him well on the soccer field, it clearly spilled over into other areas of his life.
It's a good reminder that there's always more to the story, right?
Absolutely.
We see the headlines, the controversies, but we rarely get the full picture, the human context.
We don't.
It's so easy to judge based on these isolated incidents, but
Mhm.
understanding someone's background, their struggles, their triumphs,
Right.
it allows for a much more nuanced perspective.
Absolutely.
So we've gone from early promise to World Cup glory, but also explored the dark side, those explosive moments that nearly derailed everything.
Yeah.
It's a career and a life marked by both brilliant highs and devastating lows.
It is.
Really makes you think.
It does.
And it leaves us with a lot to ponder.
It does.
How do we define legacy?
That's the question, yeah.
Is it solely based on accomplishments, or do the darker chapters matter just as much?
Right.
And what about second chances? Do we deserve them? Do we earn them?
It's tough.
Tofting's story doesn't offer easy answers.
It doesn't.
But it certainly gives us plenty to think about.
That's for sure.
All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.
See you next time.
Ever get that feeling like you're watching a highlight reel, but it's playing in reverse?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. Like, instead of a slow motion victory lap, it's a train wreck you can't look away from.
Exactly. And this time, the train wreck has a name. Tomas Ripka. Czech football legend, tough as nails on the pitch, but man, his life off the field. That's a whole other story. We're diving deep into that dissonance today.
Right, the rise and fall of Thomas Repka. And we've got a lot to unpack because this isn't just your typical athlete gone bad story.
Okay, so for our listeners who might not remember Repka at his peak, let's rewind a bit.
Right, so picture this. 46 caps for the Czech national team, right?
Mm-hmm.
A mainstay for clubs like Fiorentina, West Ham.
West Ham! That's got to be like a badge of honor for a certain kind of player. The fans loved him there.
Exactly. And for good reason.
Hmm.
This guy was known for his hard tackling, no-nonsense defending. He was the kind of player opponents hated to play against, but fans, they adored him for it.
But then things take a turn. And not just a little stumble, we're talking a full-on header into the penalty box.
Yeah, 2019, it all kind of comes to a head.
2019, that recently. I feel like I'm getting old.
You and me both. But yeah, 2019, Revka gets slapped with a 15-month prison sentence. And it's not even for, like, assault or something you might expect from a hard man like him. It's fraud.
Fraud? Seriously?
Yeah, apparently he sold a luxury car that, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly his to sell.
Wow. Okay, that's a bit more than a parking ticket, all right? I mean, you figure a guy with his career earnings, what's the motivation there?
Right, like you'd think he'd be set for life. That's part of what makes this whole thing so perplexing.
It's like the ultimate own goal, But okay, fraud, that's bad, but was it like a one-time thing? A moment of,
See, that's where it gets really interesting. Turns out Repka already had 2 suspended sentences, both for drunk driving.
Okay, so the guy liked to live on the edge, even off the pitch.
Seems that way. But the thing is, that fraud conviction, it was like a catalyst. Suddenly, those suspended sentences weren't suspended anymore.
Oh, wow. Talk about your past catching up to you.
Yeah, he ended up having to serve an extra 9 months because of it.
Man, you almost have to feel bad for the guy. Almost. I mean, the contrast is almost Shakespearean, right? On the field, all discipline, all focus, a true team player. Then off the field, it's like a completely different script.
Totally. And that's what makes this such a fascinating case. Because you see this a lot with athletes, right? The pressure, the fame, the money. It can warp your sense of reality.
It's like that old saying, money doesn't change you, it just amplifies who you already are.
Exactly. And for some people, the transition out of professional sports is tough. You go from this life of routine, of structure, of constant adoration, and then suddenly it's over.
Yeah, like what's a retired footballer supposed to do? Open a pub.
Well, some do. But you're right, it's a huge adjustment, and a lot of athletes struggle with that. Then you factor in things like potential financial mismanagement, maybe some lingering injuries. It can be a recipe for disaster.
It's easy to forget that these guys, these legends we put on pedestals, they're human too. Just because you can bend it like Beckham doesn't mean you're immune to the same temptations, the same pitfalls as the rest of us.
And we kind of expect these guys to be role models, right?
Right.
But as this whole Repka situation shows us, that's not always the reality.
For sure. It's sad, though. I mean, here's a guy who achieved incredible things on the pitch, but his legacy, it's tarnished, overshadowed by these really avoidable mistakes.
That's the real tragedy, isn't it? That his talent, his contribution to Czech football, it all takes a back seat to this narrative of recklessness, of poor judgment.
It makes you wonder, how much do we as fans, how much do we factor in an athlete's personal life when we assess their legacy? Do we separate the art from the artist, so to speak, or are those lines always going to be blurred?
That's the question, right? Because we like to think we can separate the two, but
But it's hard, right?
it is. I mean, think about it. Does Repka's story make you see some of your other favorite athletes, even the seemingly squeaky clean ones, in a different light? Makes you wonder what goes on behind closed doors, behind that carefully crafted public persona.
It definitely makes you think. And that's what this deep dive is all about, really. Getting people to think critically, to look beyond the headlines, beyond the highlight reels.
Absolutely. Because in the end, the Tomas Repka story, it's not just about one man's fall from grace. It's a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the brightest stars can stumble. And sometimes those stumbles, they have lasting consequences.
And that's all the time we have for this deep dive. We'll leave you with that thought. How much do you factor in when it comes to your sporting heroes?
All right, let's dive into this one, huh? We're
Yeah.
talking Tony Varells. Buckle up, because this is a wild ride. Goals, controversy, you name it. And we've got a ton of your research to unpack.
Yeah, it's a story that grabs you. Hometown hero to, well, national headlines for all the wrong reasons.
Exactly. So we start in Nancy Franz. Homegrown talent, right? Was he always destined for greatness?
You could say that. Even as a kid, his instincts around the goal were incredible. Not just luck, real talent.
Right.
Right place, right time, always.
A natural, those are hard to come by. But Lens, that's where he blew up, yeah.
Absolutely. 95, he joins Lens, and boom, everything changes. Not just personal awards, but his goals. They win the 98 League One title. Their first ever, by the way. Massive.
Talk about leaving your mark. To be part of that, wow. Must have been an amazing time for French football.
Electric. The league was so competitive back then, and Lens, with Varells up front, they were a force. Real grit. Fans loved it.
And then, bam, he gets called up to the national team. Every player's dream. But talk about pressure, playing with Zidane, Henry, that whole era.
Exactly. And it's interesting, he only won 8 caps, which in a way tells you how stacked that team was. To even be considered, the skill in those training sessions alone, top level.
Just to be in that room, even for a bit. But we can't forget, 99, he moves to Lyon. Bigger club, Champions League, whole other world.
Strategic move. Lyon was a powerhouse, always going for titles. Champions League puts you on another level, up against the best in Europe.
Like that Ajax game in '02 that you pointed out. What was so special about that one?
Back and forth, really tense. Lyon won, but Varells, he actually started on the bench that game. Came on in the second half, and man, did he change the game. Energy just shifted. Lyon's attack was relentless. He didn't score, but you could feel the impact. Shows how even at that level, your role can change,
Tough competition, even at Lyon, to be a starter. Makes you think about the choices players make. But just looking back at this part of his career, what stands out to you about Varells' rise? He really did live that whole local boy makes good story.
He did. But I think his move to Lyon, it's key. It was a step up, sure, but also new pressures. At Lens, he was the man. Lyon, much bigger team, more stars, double-edged sword, right? More exposure, but way more competition, and that matters, especially as we get into what happens next.
You mentioned what happens next, and that's where things get complicated. 2011, right? Varells is retired, enjoying life after football. You'd think that's it, happy ending.
Right, you'd expect what, relaxing, maybe some coaching, who knows?
Not exactly. What went down?
October 22nd, 2011. Varell and his brothers, they're at a nightclub. Essili Nancy, I think. Sources are a little fuzzy on the details, but there's some kind of altercation. Them and the club's security guards.
Hold on. We're talking a former national team player in a nightclub fight. This is messy, even if it's just a misunderstanding.
It gets worse. Things escalate and security guards get injured. And then shots are fired.
Shots fired. Okay, this isn't just some bar brawl anymore. This is serious.
Yeah, things get way out of hand. Police are called. Varels and his brothers, they're arrested.
Oh, yeah.
And the charges. Attempted murder.
Attempted murder. Wow. Talk about a fall from grace. From scoring goals to, what was the reaction like?
France was shocked. This was huge news. Tony Varels, the hometown hero, League One champ, facing serious time. Nobody saw it coming.
From football star to, wow, facing those kinds of charges.
Right.
What was his defense?
So, through all of it, and it was a long process, years, Varels always said he was innocent. He and his brothers, they claimed self-defense, said they felt threatened, had to protect themselves.
Self-defense in a nightclub. I can only imagine the legal wrangling. How long did this whole thing go on for?
Oh, over a decade. Can you believe that? 11 years. From that night at the club to the final verdict in 2022.
11 years, that's a long time. What did the court decide?
Guilty. Attempted murder, 5 years in prison, but 2 years were suspended, so he ended up serving 3.
3 years. That's heavy. Especially compared to, winning titles, playing for France. Did this change how people saw his career, his achievements?
It definitely complicates things, doesn't it? It's hard to square that image of Varels, the local kid who made it big, with, this conviction.
Makes you think. Someone can achieve amazing things, but still make terrible choices, face serious consequences.
It's a reminder that people are complicated. We like our stories simple, especially with athletes, right? Heroes, villains. But life's not like that.
No, it's never that simple. Tony Varels, his stories gave both. The highest highs, and then, well, this. Leaves you with a lot to think about. Does it change how you see his accomplishments? Tough question.
Maybe that's the point. It makes you look past the headlines, past the easy answers. Even with the verdict, we don't know everything about that night. And that, I think, is worth remembering.